What's up, everybody? I'm Derek, this is Rocking eForge, and today it is extra cold. And I know by the time this video is airing, it's probably mid to late February, but it is middle of January where I'm at right now, and I am very grateful that I'm going to be doing some forge welding today to try to warm myself up. Because today I am going to be forging a wrapped eye Tomahawk, so let's get rocking. Alright, so the first thing you're going to see me put in the forge here is a big chunk of just mild steel. This is not going to become the actual Tomahawk, but it's actually going to give me a little bit of an advantage in the forge welding process. Once this big chunk of steel has gotten hot, I'm going to lay it on the face of my anvil in order to kind of allow that heat to soak into the anvil itself. This will preheat my anvil because it's such a cold day, and actually help me make the forge weld better because the anvil itself won't suck out all of the heat of the piece when I end up forge welding everything together. Now the piece I'm actually going to start out with is a piece of 1.5 by 1/4 inch mild steel flat stock, and this is what we're going to wrap around and forge weld together to create the eye of the Tomahawk. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is use the cross peen of my cross peen hammer to begin spreading this piece of steel on both ends. And this will end up becoming the width of the blade. And I'm going to spread that up about 2 to 3 inches from either end. All right, so I spread this to about 2.5 inches wide from the 1.5 inch original width of the stock. I've got this kind of gradually spread up to about 3 inches up the length of the stock. So now I'm going to do my darndest to reproduce that on the other side, and I'll see you back here once I've done that. All right, so now I've got this spread out on both sides. Now the next heat, I'm going to heat up the center primarily and then bend this over into a U. And I'm not going to close that up yet because I want to make sure that everything's aligned, and then I'm going to actually come in and grind the inside of the surface that's actually going to contact each other into the forge weld. That way it is as clean as I can possibly get it before I actually weld this thing up. As you can see, getting this even is easier said than done. All right, so now I've got that pretty well lined up, and I'm going to take one more heat to kind of compress this down a little bit, get things a little skinnier, to do as much work as possible to get this as close as I can to finished before I cool it down, grind the inside of this in order to facilitate the forge weld. And this has the added requirement that I end up, open that up a little, that I end up realigning everything, which is another reason why I wanted to do this before I did any grinding. All right, so this ended up getting a little bit curved that direction and curved the other direction on the other side. And I'd like to get this to meet up all the way along both edges as much as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this around. It's a good spot for it. Now it's drop forged. I'm going to spin this around, and I'm going to end up hammering on this together, and then I will chisel down the middle, split it apart so I can grind the inside of that. All right, so that lines up a bit better on both sides. Now I'm going to chisel down through here and open it up slightly so that I can clean off all the scale, make sure I've got a clean surface to facilitate that forge weld. All right, so now that I am done grinding that, we're going to go back to the forge and leave this here for a little bit. Now I've got a piece of 1 by 1/8 inch 1095, which is a high carbon steel that I'm going to spread out on one edge in order to prep this for the forge weld, and this is going to become the hardened edge of the Tomahawk. And I'm thinning out this edge in order to forge weld this as a bit into the blade. And I learned in the process of making my tiny mouse hawk that if you don't taper the bit that you're forge welding into the Tomahawk, that you'll have a gap. And that can lead to cracking and splitting of the blade if you're using it to chop or throwing it into hard wood over and over and over again. So to avoid that, I'm forging down one side about as thin as I can. Not paper thin because that has a potential to burn, but as thin as I can to give it the best chance of forge welding into a complete fused blade here. Now you'll notice that I'm picking up a curve away from the side that I am spreading this on. That's partially because I'm using the rounding face of my rounding hammer, but also strictly because I'm forging on this edge, which is causing spreading away from that. I am going to correct that prior to forge welding this in there. I'm also going to grind each of these edges down slightly at a chamfer, which should hopefully give me a bit better of a forge weld between the two pieces of steel. 3 pieces of steel if you want to get technical. And then I'm going to bring the head back to the forge, heat this up at the eye portion, and close this down onto the bit. I'm going to go back to the grinder and grind this up, but you don't need to see that. I'm sure you've gotten plenty enough grinding as it is. I just kind of closed that up. And before I start heating up the blade portion of this, I'm going to go ahead and throw in some Iron Mountain Flux. Then I'm going to turn this around and close this up ever so slightly before I go back and fit that bit in the end of the blade there. I'm going to go ahead and put this bit in here. All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and give this some taps to kind of close everything up as best I can. And this has a pretty decent amount of flux in there to try to prevent any oxidation between the pieces of steel that would prevent any forge welding. And now I'm going to bring this up to a welding temperature, and we'll give it some nice light taps to hopefully get a really nice weld on this. After many heats at a welding temperature, that should be all pretty well welded together. Obviously, I've still got pretty visible seams right on the edges, and I'm going to end up grinding just a little bit away on each of those seams, just to make sure that those seams don't end up opening up as cracks. But I'm going to have to let this cool down to do that, so I am finished for tonight. All right, so it is now plenty cool to the touch. It's honestly ice cold because it got down below freezing last night. It is now time to get to the grinding and dressing of all of the faces on this Tomahawk. So first thing I'm going to do is cut off these kind of little extra overhang pieces from the 1095 bit that I put in here, and then I'm going to grind these seams, and let's keep on rocking. All right, so this is very roughly ground down now, and I've been looking at the seams, and I've done quite a bit of grinding on these edges where those seams are, and I've got it down to where it's definitely disappeared in spots, but there's obviously one or two spots like here where the end of the bit must have been a little too thick to result in a good weld in that area. Got a little better on the other side. However, it wasn't a perfect weld. I think the bit itself got a pretty decent weld. There's a little bit of seam here and there, and I'm going to grind this down to be basically just 1095 on the edge anyway. So that'll hopefully take care of any separation that's in that first couple millimeters of the outer sheathing of this mild steel. I've also noticed that it is a little bit curved. The blade itself has a little bit of a curve this direction, and it's not quite on center. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this back in the forge, straighten this out, and then we'll move on to getting the bevel put in and kind of more finely grinding this piece once I've got everything straightened and ready for the next stage. And I've brought this back up to a welding heat to straighten it out, to hopefully facilitate any unwelded spots in that steel. And I'll have to clean all this back off. And now that I've still got some heat in there, I'm going to switch to my crossbeam hammer and give this Tomahawk a little bit of shape. It feels nice and solid, so I'm going to say it's probably pretty well welded up. All right, I'm going to do one more heat just to try to bring this kind of, I'm trying to get almost a curved top here and then curve it up on the bottom here. So I'm just trying to move that direction. I'm not going to go all the way back to a welding heat because I think we've got the weld pretty well set at this point. That was really just a precaution from the previous welding heat, but I'd noticed that the seams were a little more prevalent than I wanted them to be, and decided to just take it back there in the shaping phase, just as kind of a precaution. I guess it's a little too much curve. That's better. Unfortunately, thanks to the bit that's welded in there, the edge is thicker than the rest of the material, which makes it difficult at best to keep it from getting a warp when you're hammering down on the middle portion of the blade, and that portion's pushing upward. All right, so I think I've got the shape pretty well where I want it. I noticed there was a little bit of a twist between the eye and the actual piece. And I'm just wanting to iron that out a little bit. It's still out of line. I think I need to bring this portion of the blade back in line actually, so I'm gonna spin this around. I'm gonna fiddle around with this, take it back to the grinder and grind off all this extra scale, but you don't need to see that, so we'll meet back up here once I've got this kind of close in to where I want it. All right, so one of the last things I need to do here before we really get to the finishing process is to widen the top of the eye and make sure it's centered. And I'm using the horn of my anvil here because, well, I tried to use a drift and it was simply too small. But what I'm trying to do here is make sure that the top of the eye is wider than the bottom of the eye, because the intent for a tomahawk is not to wedge the handle into the eye like you would a hammer or a hatchet, but to simply have a handle that is tapered so that it fits through the top of the eye and you can just tap it in lightly and it should friction fit the handle to the head itself. Now I think I've still got this pretty well skinnier on top than I do on the bottom, which is unfortunate. I should have checked that before forging in this shape. I could have shaped it the opposite direction if I had thought that far ahead, but it'll all work out all right. And I think that is going to do it for all of the forging process. I touch marked, I got a nice annealing cycle, a couple thermocycles out of it. I widened the top of the eye a little bit, and in the process of doing all of the grinding and everything to kind of refine the shape, I decided I actually wanted to leave it scaly, and I'm going to do a wire brush finish on it, but I do need to grind in the bevels. So I'm gonna let this cool down, we're gonna take it back to the grinder, get some bevels ground in here, and then we will move on to the heat treat. All right, so I've got the bevels ground in on this tomahawk, and I've got them ground down to about 1/16 of an inch. I don't want to get it too thin along the edge before I go ahead and heat treat this, because I don't want the edge to be so skinny that it actually has a propensity to warp. And I'm only going to do an edge quench on this because the only hardenable steel in this tomahawk head is the edge itself, that 1095 bit. So we're gonna bring this up nice and slow in my forge. I'm gonna be placing a magnet on the tray of my forge so that I can make sure that it reaches non-magnetic. I wanna get it a little hotter than that non-magnetic temperature, and then I will quench it in some preheated mineral oil that I've got in this ammo can. And this oil is preheated to about 130 degrees just by quenching different pieces of mild steel to get it hot enough. I'm just gonna cool that head off completely now. All right, get this wiped down. And then I'm going to take this and put it immediately into a preheated toaster oven for a tempering cycle. I'm gonna leave this in here for about 2 hours at 400 degrees. That's gonna temper and reduce the hardness and the brittleness in the edge. That was the result of the quench. And in the meantime, we're gonna go work on the handle. All right, so now after the tempering process, I'm working on the fine adjustments of getting the handle fit up to the head of this tomahawk. And then once I've got the handle roughed in, I'm just gonna take the bevels that I ground previously down to the edge itself. This will result in a bit of a thin edge for a tomahawk or an axe, but in terms of doing a quick project, this will do just fine. And partway through grinding the bevels down, I remembered that I wanted to wire wheel this and kind of polish up the forge scale, make it look nice. And I'm glad I remembered when I did, because it's way better to do this before I put a sharp edge on this so that I'm not risking cutting myself. You can see me actually skipping off the wire wheel a couple of times here. That would have been pretty nasty if that blade was sharp. If you were making a knife or a tomahawk or a hatchet or anything of that nature, make sure you're getting things done before you actually sharpen as much as possible. Now we're back to grinding those bevels, and we're going to take that down to a sharp edge, and then we'll move back to finishing up the handle. And that is going to wrap up this tomahawk. It's certainly not perfect by any means. I've got a bit of a gap here on the bottom side of the eye. The handle is pretty rough, none finished. I didn't, sand it to any level of polish or anything, but it does what I need it to, and it's meant to be a takedown design like typical Tomahawks are. All you gotta do is do a quick couple of taps, and it's back to being throwable. Now that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me in the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link's in the description below the video. Or please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel. And as always, keep on rocking. Oh, all right. First try. Well, I'd say that doesn't quite meet the intent. Oh, thank goodness. I put the microphone right there. I managed not to kill it. It hit the wood. Maybe I should rethink that position. Nope. Went too fast on that one, thinking I could do it. There we go. A little over-rotated on that one. Hey. I'll take it. Bounced. Oh.